of Thomas Tuchel, whatever way you want to frame this, either way, he left the Chelsea job after 7 games this season after spending £300 million in the summer transfer window. John Brewin joins us on the line. John, good evening to you.
Good evening, Richie. How are you?
Not too bad, thank you. We've got Kenny here with us as well, John. And
hi, Kenny.
How's it going, John?
Like I say, a bit of a surprise to some degree. I think everybody's kind of got that element of surprise that it came so early in the season, but also it seemed as if Thomas Tuchel had been spoiling for a fight from the first kickoff of this season as well. So in that aspect, this departure hasn't necessarily come as all that huge of a surprise.
I have to say, it still came as a surprise. Having said that, he watched the Dinamo Zagreb game last night, and he didn't look like he had longed for this world. You maybe would have thought he might get another game or two, but yeah, the signals coming out of Chelsea have not been great for a while. I was down at Cobham about 3 weeks ago, in fact. And during the press conference he gave, it was ahead of the Leeds game, which they ended up losing. He talked of... actually, he was asked a question about a new contract, which he said he was happy to sign, but he left it with his representatives, and I think the words were, you know that I love it here. And he did seem very settled in Chelsea and Chelsea life. Funny enough, my dad lives in Cobham and has seen Thomas Tuchel wandering the streets of Cobham, looking very relaxed there, in coffee bars and all the rest of it. But
expensive coffee there, John.
Absolutely.
Cobham High Street.
Cobham High Street. It's not cheap, as you know, Kenny. Yes, exactly.
That's how I've heard.
He's lived there 30 years before it went completely posh. But yeah, I do find it quite amusing that he lives among the footballers and all the rest of it. But yeah, and he said that you've seen him around, very relaxed guy. And the thing is, if you meet Thomas Tuchel or you go to one of his press conferences, he's a pretty relaxed guy. Sees through the nonsense of the media and so on. But the reports from behind the scenes are that he can be a very intense character. And actually think about his reign at Borussia Dortmund and at PSG. And if you think about those, both of those ended in some sort of rancor with the players and with the officials at the club that he worked at. And that appears to have followed the same pattern here. I think we can say that Thomas Tuchel is a good manager, but you might have to consider him as a short-term manager. But there is this extra variable, and the one that you introduced there, Richie, is that they have spent £250, £300 million, signed him a striker in Aubameyang, who he's supposed to be close to, that nobody else really wanted. And he was also, he had a bit of a nightmare against Dinamo Zagreb, by the way. And then you've got this player, and you've got these signings, and you've got this manager who has to work with these signings that he's made. And there's been this idea of that they were not happy that he dismissed the idea of signing Ronaldo out of hand. There appears to have been a culture clash there. And again, as you said, it did appear that Thomas Tuchel, if there was an exit door, he didn't mind walking through it in the end.
Yeah, he'd looked increasingly stressed and increasingly, worn out by the gig over the course of the last few weeks. I think the Spurs thing was just a flashpoint of all that, or it certainly looked to be from the outside. But on that, the spending of 250, 300 million, bringing in players that he was clearly close to and preferring those signings over the likes of Ronaldo. How much truth is there in that schism between Todd Boehly and Thomas Tuchel, do we think, over the Ronaldo potential deal?
Well, I think that story is true. I think the thing is that Todd Boehly and the Clear Lake Consortium came in, and there's this idea that they were novices in this world, but what they do is, from what I understand, they engaged a couple of agents to help them through this process. Todd Boehly taking on this role as temporary sporting director always seemed quite pointed, didn't it? I'm going to control these things. And what that means is that you've got this relationship between Tuchel and essentially his boss. And I think he's on record as saying that he's found it easier working where he's just coaches. And he did say that when he arrived at Chelsea in the first place, because you had Marina Granovskaya running things, you had Petr Cech involved, and Tuchel was just allowed to get on with the running of the team. You get the impression that Thomas Tuchel doesn't react too well to distractions, and that there is this idea that the Todd Boehly regime would ask him to explain most things, whereas a manager working at the top of the game would expect the executives around him to understand how things worked. And there was obviously some friction there. But, if we were to consider the Roman Abramovich regime, the one that Todd Boehly replaced, Tuchel getting sacked at this point of the season wouldn't represent any shock at all, would it? When you consider the performances, a couple of away defeats, a defeat in the Champions League, that's just Chelsea. That's the Chelsea we've come to expect. And I suppose what is a surprise, or what is something we perhaps didn't expect, is that the new Chelsea is acting in this same fashion.
It's a strange one in that Chelsea have always had, at least in the Abramovich era, someone like Michael Emanolo, someone like Marina Granovskaya to be that buffer, I guess, between Abramovich and the manager, whoever that might be. And there have been several, obviously, over the past 2 decades. But they always seem to get the business of the club running pretty smoothly. And it didn't really become the concern of the manager, and it kind of walled them off from that. Todd Boehly taking all of this on seems a bit of a stretch, especially for someone who's a new owner. I mean, Abramovich knew enough to know that he didn't know about certain aspects and put people like that in charge of them. Whereas Todd Boehly seems to be clasping his hands and say, it's grand, I've got this, I'll take charge of all these things.
Well, you could never account for the ego of the American tycoon, can you? Listen, I've worked for American companies in the past. The CEO is the all-seeing eye, and they take credit for everything that goes well. And for those that doesn't go well, that's not their fault, and that wasn't their decision. And it does seem to be an all-encompassing thing from Todd Boehly. Quite unusual. It's certainly completely opposite to the role that, say, the Glazers took at Manchester United. Though the one that you would compare it to, and this might be a worry for Chelsea fans, that it's a very different era, with the Hicks and Gillette thing at Liverpool, and they interfered, didn't they? And they ended up in this row with Rafa Benitez, and I suppose also the early years of FSG. I remember the rows they would have with Brendan Rodgers over transfer targets and so on. You work for an American company, you work for a company for any part of the world, they want to do it their way. They want to do it their way, which is, hey, we've got the money, we bought this club, we paid for it, we want our decisions to be final. And for a manager like Tuchel, who has delivered them a Champions League and is used to this idea that if the coach doesn't have quite the final say, his say is very important, then there is going to be friction between those two approaches.
They seem to have worked pretty quickly, though, in identifying a successor. That successor seems to be, if I were to believe today, is going to be Graham Potter. A quick decision, at least, from Todd Boehly and those advising him.
Yeah, but I suppose if you were to consider that they... Graham Potter has worked at Brighton for Tony Bloom, who, is... if not an autocratic owner, he's someone that likes a big say in what goes on in the club. They've also had Dan Ashworth, the sporting director, who's now with Newcastle. And I think maybe what Todd Boehly and his advisors around him have thought, who's the best at operating within the structure that they eventually want to operate at Chelsea? Well, that would be Graham Potter. And I suppose one of the things about Graham Potter is he is not someone like Tuchel who is given to public shows of frustration, or is someone who you might expect friction. I'm not sure that's totally the case. I mean, I don't know Graham Potter. I mean, those fairly downbeat Midlands England tones suggest a guy that's, takes things in his stride. I've always found in a press conference that he's very circumspect, even at a time when I've seen, they've beaten Tottenham. They pulled off big victories. Saw them at West Ham the other week. Just very methodical in the way that he talks through things. But there's a few players at Brighton that have been bombed out in a similar fashion to those that happened with Tuchel at Chelsea. Every manager wants his own way in the end. It's a big step up for him. But I think one of the things about Potter is that underneath that unassuming public face, there's perhaps an ambitious guy there. I mean, over when he was in, was it Ostersunds, the club that he was with Yeah, I mean, he did a lot of interviews with people in the UK, made sure that his name was out there. He didn't hang around too long at Swansea when the bigger job came up. And I suppose if you like someone like Graham Potter, then you might think a job like Chelsea is not going to come your way. There's no reason why he wouldn't take that job. Obviously, it's going to secure him financially. Is he the right man for Chelsea? I don't know. If Chelsea stop being chaotic, then someone calm like Potter might suit it. Maybe that's what they're trying to do, change the culture of the club to increase that level of calm. But I think there are a few questions to be asked about him as a manager, just because of his level of experience, and also the level of experience of the people that own the club as well, because they've shown, particularly in that transfer window business that they did, that's inexperience. You can't just go out and spend 250 million and sack the manager straight after it. It's not the done thing in football, is it?
No.
Soccer, so we call it.
It is remarkable that it will be a huge step up for Graham Potter, because the size of the task at hand, from the one between Brighton and the one at Chelsea, is day and night. And as you say, there's a really unstable situation there at the moment, whereby he's coming into a squad that isn't his, and he has to try and steady the ship as quickly as possible, and while still aiming them towards winning a Champions League and getting back into the Champions League via the league next year. I mean, that's all pretty big and stuff that he hasn't dealt with before as a manager, and that's a giant leap.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could say, if you actually look at it over the last, let's say 10, 11 months, Chelsea haven't been in that great form. If you look back to the start of the 21-22 season, it was them, City, Liverpool. Those are the contenders. But what was keeping Tuchel in the job was that he'd won the Champions League, because those are the standards that are expected of a Chelsea manager. You have to win big prizes. They did lose 3 cup finals as well, which probably counted against him in the end. But even at Chelsea, that's not enough, is it? I mean, we saw, how many months did Di Matteo last after winning the Champions League 10 years ago? It was 4, 5, say, at the most. You are, and that's part of Chelsea, the culture of Chelsea as it was and as it appears to be, that huge pressure. And as you say, Richie, he's not been in that position before. And it's a huge test of any manager if you actually look at the quality of manager that's been through that club. Jose Mourinho, whatever you think of him now, one of the greatest managers of all time. Conte, a modern great. Carlo Ancelotti, all of them are full and foul of the Chelsea culture. Now, we have a new Chelsea, but the club, despite its owners changing, isn't going to change that quickly, is it? And at the end of the season, having sacked a manager in 6th place, and Graham Potter's there, and he doesn't get them into the Champions League, what happens to Graham Potter then? Well, that's the question, isn't it? Because we don't know how the Todd Boehly regime, the Clear Lake regime, is going to react. There's so many intangibles with this story. It really is a very interesting development.
John, do you not think, I think there'll be a perception out there amongst most the footballing public, somebody in Graham Potter's position, manager of Brighton, mid-table club, an opportunity to manage Chelsea. If he's offered it, he's just got to take it. Why wouldn't he? But
yeah.
I just feel as if with Potter, Star's very much on the rise. I take a point, he hasn't proved himself to the top level. But if you took that argument to its extreme, you'd never give any manager an opportunity. At some point, even the great managers, somebody gave them an opportunity at some point to prove themselves in an elite environment. Now, I'm a big fan of Potter, what he's done in the last year. I think he's kind of very bright, very intelligent. I think he'll assess this situation very quickly. I'm not convinced if he's even offered that job, he'll necessarily take it for the reasons that you're saying, in terms of a bit of general madness around the football club, particularly upstairs above him, in terms of how he'd have to manage that situation. And I think he'd be, would be the worst advice in the world to maybe take a step back, stay where you are, continue your development, continue to set the standards that you have at Brighton, and maybe a job of a similar stature will come up in the next 2 to 3 years, maybe even the biggest one of all. I'd suggest even at Manchester City, if Guardiola elects to step away in the next year or two. If you were to ask me, John, if Guardiola was to suggest to the owners, the kingmakers at Manchester City, who he wants to come in and continue his legacy at Manchester City and continue in terms of his philosophy, style of play, etc., I think Graham Potter would be very high on his list, on Pep Guardiola's list, in terms of people to replace him. Don't know how you feel.
Yeah, I think It's a fair assessment. Yeah, I mean, I do. I'm always, when these type of things come up, I always remember this quote, and this actually turned out quite ill-fated in the end. But it was from Brian Kidd. Remember, Brian Kidd was offered the Blackburn job back in 1998, and Brian Kidd has that very hushed Mancunian tones, doesn't he? And he just said, "I didn't want to die wondering, what it would be like to be a manager." And I think if you were Graham Potter and you were offered, I mean, I don't know what the salary would be, but it would be 7 figures, say, a year. Let's say that. Take that job. Could you turn it down? I don't know.
Can't be money, John, from his. He's going to earn what he's earning now. But he's a young manager, John. He's going to earn a huge amount of money over a prolonged period of time. I'd be very disappointed, actually. Maybe I've got his character totally wrong. If I thought financially that was going to be his biggest decision in terms of whether to take that job or not. I actually look at him in the other way. I think he looks at it from a different lens completely in terms of his career development. And I think potentially he looks for the reasons that you said, like I said, and we all maybe suspect just timing. Normally you'd say Chelsea, possibly so, why wouldn't you? But I just think at the moment, I don't think there's a necessity for him to go and jump in there into the fire with his fingers crossed and just kind of hope he kind of lands and manages to turn things around. I think he's young enough, John, to take a step away, continue where he is at the moment and just, eye the landscape and just wait for potentially another one of those jobs to come up.
All right, Kenny. John, we've run out of time. John, thanks a million so much for joining us, and pleasure as always.
Great to talk to you, lads.
Cheers, John.
There you go. There's John Brewin and football on Off the Ball, brought to you by Sky. European action is back. You can watch every UEFA Champions League and Europa League match this season live on BT Sport. We're going to be keeping tabs on Liverpool's adventures in Naples tonight. Also Tottenham in the Chris Waddle derby at home to Marseille. And we'll be talking to David Gillick very shortly indeed.
Football on Off the Ball.
With Sky. Get all the football you love in one place across Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.
Future-proof.
We've known for a long time that animals are intelligent, have feelings, can feel sorrow and joy. But what about plants? A relatively new field of science called plant neurobiology is daring to suggest